Hi guys, today we're going to read part 2 of chapter 7 in Holes. Remember, this chapter is going back and forth between Stanley and his grandfather's story. So we're going to start on his great-great-grandfather's story. Myra's father got down on his hands and his knees and looked closely to examine each pig tail to snout. "Those are two of the finest pigs I have ever seen," he said at last. "How am I to decide? I have only one daughter." "Why not let Myra decide?" suggested Ilya. "That's preposterous," explained Igor, expelling saliva as he spoke. "Myra is just an empty-headed girl," said her father. "How can she possibly decide when I, her father, can't?" "She knows how she feels in her heart," said Ilya. Myra's father rubbed his chin. Then he laughed and said, "Why not?" He slapped Ilya on the back. "It doesn't matter to me. A pig is a pig." He summoned his daughter. Ilya blushed when Myra entered the room. "Good afternoon, Myra," he said. She looked at him. "You're Ilya, right?" she asked. "Myra," said her father, "Ilya and Igor have offered a pig for your hand in marriage. It doesn't matter to me. A pig is a pig. So I will let you make the final choice. Who do you wish to marry?" Myra looked confused. "You want me to decide?" "That's right, my blossom," said her father. "Gee, I don't know," said Myra. "Which pig weighs more?" "They both weigh the same," said her father. "Golly," said Myra. "I guess I choose Ilya. No, Igor. No, Ilya. No, Igor. Oh, I know. I'll think of a number between 1 and 10. I'll marry whoever guesses the closest to my number." "Okay, I'm ready." 10, guessed Igor. Ilya said nothing. "Ilya?" said Myra. "What number do you guess?" Ilya didn't pick a number. "Marry Igor," he muttered. "You can keep my pig as a wedding present." The next time the water truck came, it was driven by Mr. Pendensky, who also brought sack lunches. Stanley sat with his back against a pile of dirt and ate. He had a bologna sandwich, potato chips, and a large chocolate chip cookie. "How you doing?" asked Magnet. "Not real good," said Stanley. "Well, the first hole's the hardest," Magnet said. Stanley took a long, deep breath. He couldn't afford to dawdle. He was way behind the others. And the sun just kept getting hotter. It wasn't even noon yet. But he didn't know if he had enough strength to stand up. He thought about quitting. He wondered what they would do to him. What could they do? His clothes were soaked in sweat. In school, he had learned that sweating was good for you. It was nature's way to keep you cool. So why was he so hot? Using his shovel for support, he managed to get to his feet. "Where are we supposed to go to the bathroom?" he asked Magnet. Magnet gestured with his arms. "Pick a hole, any hole," he said. Stanley staggered across the lake, almost falling over a dirt pile. Behind him, he heard Magnet say, "But first, make sure nothing's living in it." After leaving Myra's house, Ilya wandered aimlessly through town until he found himself down by the wharf. He sat on the edge of the pier and stared down into the cold, black water. He could not understand how Myra had trouble deciding between him and Igor. He thought she loved him. Even if she didn't love him, couldn't she see what a foul person Igor was? It was like Madame Zeroni had said. Her head was as empty as a flower pot. Some men were gathering on the dock, and he went to see what was going on. A sign read, "Deckhands wanted, free passage to America." He had no sailing experience, but the ship's captain signed him aboard. The captain could see that Ilya was a man of good strength. Not everyone could carry a full-grown pig up the side of a mountain. It wasn't until he was heading out across the Atlantic that he suddenly remembered his promise to carry Madame Zeroni up the mountain. He felt terrible. He wasn't afraid of the curse. He thought that was a lot of nonsense. He felt bad because he knew Madame Zeroni had wanted to drink from the stream before she died. Zero was the smallest kid in Group D, but he was the first one to finish digging. "You're finished?" Stanley asked enviously. Zero said nothing. Stanley walked to Zero's hole and watched him measure it with his shovel. The top of the hole was a perfect circle, and the sides were smooth and steep. Not one dirt clod more than necessary had been removed from the earth. Zero pulled himself to the surface. He didn't even smile. He looked down at his perfectly dug hole, spat in it, turned around, and headed back to the camp compound. "Zero's one weird dude," said Zigzag. Stanley would have laughed, but he didn't have the strength. Zigzag had to be the weirdest dude Stanley had ever seen. He had a long, skinny neck, a big round head with wild, frizzy blonde hair that stuck out in all directions. He had seemed to bob up and down on his neck like it was a spring. Armpit was the second one to finish digging. He also spat into his hole before heading back to the camp compound. One by one, Stanley watched each of the boys spit into his hole and return to the camp compound. Stanley kept digging. His hole was almost up to his shoulder, although it was hard to tell exactly where the ground was because the dirt had been completely surrounded around the hole. The deeper he got, the harder it was to raise the dirt up. In America, Ilya learned to speak English. He fell in love with a woman named Sarah Miller. She could push a plow, milk a goat, and most important, think for herself. She and Ilya stayed up half the night talking and laughing together. Their life was not easy. Ilya worked hard but had bad luck that seemed to follow him everywhere. He always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He remembered Madame Zeroni telling him that she had a son in America. Ilya was forever looking for him. He'd walk up to complete strangers and ask if they were named Zeroni or have ever heard of anybody named Zeroni. No one did. Ilya wasn't sure what he had done if he would ever find somebody named Madame Zeroni's son anyway. Carry him up a mountain and sing the pig lullaby to him? After his barn was struck by lightning for a third time, he told Sarah about his broken promise to Madame Zeroni. "I'm worse than a pig thief," he said. "You should just leave me and find someone who isn't cursed." "I'm not leaving you," said Sarah, "but I want you to do one thing for me." "Anything," said Ilya. Sarah smiled. "Sing me the pig lullaby." He sang it for her. Her eyes sparkled. "That's so pretty. What does it mean?" Ilya tried his best to translate it from Latvian to English, but it wasn't the same. "It rhymes in Latvian," he told her. "I could tell," said Sarah. A year later, their child was born. Sarah named him Stanley because she noticed that Stanley was Yelnats spelled backwards. Sarah changed the words of the pig lullaby so that they rhyme, and every night she sang it to little Stanley. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was as soft as the skies, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, crying to the moon, if only, if only. Stanley's hole was as deep as his shovel, but not quite wide enough on the bottom. He grimaced as he sliced off a chunk of dirt and then raised it up and flung it to the pile. He laid his shovel back down, and to his surprise, it fit. He rotated it and only had to chip off a few chunks of dirt here and there before it would lay flat in every direction. He heard the water truck approaching and felt a strange sense of pride being able to show Mr. Sir or Mr. Pendensky that he had dug his first hole. He put his hands on the rim and tried to pull himself up. He couldn't do it. His arms were too weak to lift his heavy body. He used his legs to help, but he didn't have any strength. He was trapped in his hole. It was almost funny, but he wasn't in the mood to laugh. "Stanley!" he heard Mr. Pendensky call. Using his shovel, he dug 2 footholes in the hole wall. He climbed out to see Mr. Pendensky walking over to him. "I was afraid you fainted," Mr. Pendensky said. "You wouldn't be the first." "I'm finished," Stanley said, putting his blood-spotted cap back on his head. "All right," said Mr. Pendensky, raising his hand for a high five. But Stanley ignored it. He didn't have the strength. Mr. Pendensky lowered his hand and looked at Stanley's hole. Well done. You want to ride back? Stanley shook his head. I'll walk. Mr. Pendensky climbed back into the truck without filling Stanley's canteen. Stanley waited for him to drive away and then took another look at his hole. He knew it was nothing to be proud of, but he felt proud nonetheless. He sucked up his last bit of saliva and spat. The end. I hope you come join us for Chapter 8.